You ever take a job that feels like a bad idea right from the start, but you go ahead with it anyway because, well, you need the money? That's exactly how I ended up working the graveyard shift at this remote gas station just off the highway. It was the kind of place you'd drive by 100 times and never notice. Small, old, surrounded by woods on three sides, with a single road leading in and out. The kind of place that makes you feel like you're the last person on earth. When I applied, I didn't ask too many questions. I was just looking for something to pay the bills. The manager, this old guy named Greg, was eager to hire me. He didn't even bother with the usual interview questions, just went over the basics of the job and handed me a set of rules. That should have been the first red flag. Who needs rules for a gas station night shift? But I figured it was just old man paranoia. He probably dealt with too many teenagers trying to shoplift energy drinks or something. The rules were simple enough on the surface, but there were some weird ones. Like, really weird. Lock the front door at 2 a.m. sharp, no exceptions. If the phone rings between 2 and 3:33 a.m., do not answer it. The automatic coffee machine in the back is for decoration only. Never use it. Turn off all the lights inside the station at exactly 3:33 a.m. and leave them off until 4 a.m., no matter what. There were more, but those were the ones that stood out the most. Greg was serious about them too. He told me, straight-faced, that following these rules was non-negotiable. If I couldn't handle that, I could walk away before my first shift even started. I thought he was being dramatic. In hindsight, I wish I'd listened to the edge in his voice, the way his hand trembled a bit when he handed me the list. But like I said, I needed the money. The first night wasn't too bad. A few truckers came through, filling up and grabbing snacks. But other than that, the place was dead. I spent most of the shift playing games on my phone, checking the clock every so often. When 2 a.m. rolled around, I locked the front door like Greg had instructed. It felt strange, locking myself inside this tiny station with nobody around for miles, but I figured it was just some old security measure. By 3:30 a.m., I was getting restless. The place had this oppressive stillness to it, like the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. The only sound was the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above me, and even that felt too loud in the silence. I kept glancing at the coffee machine in the back. It looked old and dusty, like it hadn't been used in years, but it was hard to ignore the feeling that something was off about it. I reminded myself of the rules and resisted the temptation to mess with it. At exactly 3:33 a.m., I turned off all the lights in the station. The darkness swallowed me whole, and I could barely see my hand in front of my face. I sat there in the pitch black, my heart racing for no reason I could explain. The minutes crawled by, each one feeling like an hour, but nothing happened. No strange noises, no creepy phone calls, no sudden visitors. I made it through the night without incident. By the time my shift ended at 6 a.m., I was almost convinced that Greg's rules were just some weird tradition, a way to mess with the new guy. I laughed it off as I headed home. The second night, though, that was when things started getting strange. It began with the knocking. Around 2:15 a.m., right after I locked the door, I heard it. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the glass at the front of the station. It startled me because I hadn't heard or seen anyone pull up, and the station was so remote that we didn't get any foot traffic at that hour. I stood up, peering through the darkness, trying to make out who was standing outside, but there was no one there. Just the empty parking lot bathed in the faint glow of the streetlight. I sat back down, trying to convince myself that maybe it was just the wind rattling the glass or some other normal explanation. But the knocking came again. Louder this time. 3 sharp knocks, as if someone was trying to get my attention. I stood up again, my nerves on edge, but once more, nothing. The parking lot was still empty. The woods beyond it were silent. I reminded myself of Greg's rules. There was no mention of knocks on the glass, no specific instructions about what to do if someone was outside. I figured as long as I didn't open the door, I'd be fine. So I ignored it, or at least I tried to. But the knocking didn't stop. It got louder and more insistent, moving around the building, first at the front, then at the side window, then at the back door. Each knock felt closer, more urgent. By the time 3 a.m. rolled around, the knocking had turned into pounding. I could feel the vibrations through the floor beneath my feet. Whoever or whatever was outside wasn't going away. I clenched my jaw, trying to keep calm, but the air in the station felt heavy, thick, with something I couldn't explain. I kept looking at the clock, willing the minutes to pass faster. And then the phone rang. I glanced at the old rotary phone on the counter, my pulse quickening. The rules were clear. Do not answer the phone between 2 and 3:33 a.m. I wasn't about to break that one, not after everything else that was happening. But the phone didn't stop ringing. It just kept going, the shrill sound cutting through the silence, making the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I stood there, frozen, as the phone rang over and over. I could feel the tension in my chest rising, my hands shaking, and then after what felt like an eternity, the ringing stopped. Silence. But just as I let out a shaky breath, the phone rang again. Only this time, something was different. There was a voice, faint, almost a whisper, coming from the receiver. I couldn't make out the words at first, but as I strained to listen, my blood ran cold. It was my name. Ben, come outside. The voice was barely more than a breath, but it was unmistakable. Whoever was calling knew my name, and they were waiting outside. I didn't answer. I didn't move. I just stood there, staring at the phone, my heart pounding in my ears. The voice continued, a soft, eerie chant repeating my name over and over. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the phone went silent again. I looked at the clock. 3:33 a.m. I had to turn off the lights. With trembling hands, I flipped the switch, plunging the station into total darkness. The pounding on the windows had stopped, but I could still feel something out there watching me, waiting. The minutes ticked by, each one slower than the last. I sat in the dark, barely breathing, afraid that even the slightest sound would draw whatever was outside closer. When 4 a.m. finally came, I turned the lights back on, my hands shaking. The station looked the same, quiet, empty, as if nothing had happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that I wasn't alone. The third night was the worst. I came into work that evening already on edge. The events of the previous night had rattled me, and I had barely slept. I kept thinking about the knocking, the voice on the phone, the rules that Greg had been so insistent on. I knew I had to follow them, no matter how strange they seemed, but part of me was starting to wonder if that was even enough. Everything was quiet for the first few hours. A few regulars stopped by to fill up their tanks and grab snacks, but by 1 a.m., the station was empty again. I locked the doors at 2 a.m., just like before, and sat behind the counter, my eyes darting to the windows every few minutes. The anxiety was building, that same oppressive weight in the air that I'd felt the night before. I kept glancing at the coffee machine in the back, half expecting it to spring to life on its own. Around 2:45 a.m., the knocking started again. This time, though, it wasn't just at the door. The knocks were coming from everywhere, the windows, the walls, even the floor beneath my feet. They moved around the station, faster and louder than before, as if whatever was outside was getting impatient. And then the woman arrived. It was 3 a.m. when I saw her for the first time. She walked up to the glass door, her red dress standing out against the darkness outside. At first, I thought she was just a customer, someone lost, maybe looking for directions. But then I noticed something wasn't right. Her movements were too smooth, too deliberate. She didn't belong. I tried not to look directly at her, remembering the rules, but my curiosity got the better of me. I glanced up and immediately regretted it. Her eyes were black, not just dark or shadowed, but completely black, like two empty voids where her eyes should have been. I couldn't look away. There was something mesmerizing about her, something terrifyingly unnatural. She pressed her hand against the glass, her head tilting ever so slightly as if she was studying me, waiting for me to do something. "Let me in," she whispered, though I couldn't hear her voice through the glass. I could feel the words in my head, like she was speaking directly into my mind. I stumbled back from the door, my pulse racing. I turned off the lights at 3:33, as the rules instructed, hoping that would make her go away. The station plunged into darkness again, and for a moment, everything was silent. But when I turned the lights back on at 4 a.m., she was gone. I never saw her again after that, but the feeling she left behind never went away. I finished my last shift that week, handed Greg the keys, and quit the job. I never asked him what any of it meant. I didn't want to know. Sometimes, though, late at night, I still hear the knocking. I quit that job after the third night. I couldn't handle it anymore. There's only so much you can take before you realize that some things, no matter how much they don't make sense, are better left alone. After I handed Greg the keys, he didn't say much, just nodded like he'd been expecting it all along. There was no surprise in his eyes, no questions, almost like he knew exactly what had happened, but wasn't going to explain. That should have been the end of it, right? Walk away from the place, leave the strange rules, the knocking, the voice on the phone, and the woman in red behind. It should have been over, but it wasn't. I tried to forget about it. For weeks after I quit, I didn't talk about what had happened. Not to my girlfriend, not to my friends. What was I going to say? That the gas station I worked at seemed haunted? That a woman with black eyes whispered in my head? Or that I had to turn off all the lights to keep her from getting in? No one would believe me. Hell, I barely believed it. It felt easier to pretend it never happened, to chalk it up to overwork or my imagination. But that feeling, the one I had in the gas station, that eerie weight like something was watching me, it followed me home. It lingered. And after a while, it started to get worse. The first time I noticed something strange at home was about a week after I quit. I was in my apartment, sitting on the couch, flipping through channels, trying to relax. It was late, probably close to midnight, and the apartment was quiet. Too quiet, really. There was no usual hum of the neighbor's TV or the traffic outside. The silence felt thick, like it was pressing in on me. That's when I heard the knock. At first, I thought it was the front door, a soft knock, just like the one I'd heard on the first night at the gas station. It was 3 knocks, slow and deliberate. I froze on the couch, my heart suddenly racing. I stared at the door for a long moment, waiting for something else to happen. Maybe it was a neighbor, maybe it was nothing. But there was no one at the door. I stood up, forcing myself to go and check. I unlocked the door and pulled it open, peering into the dimly lit hallway outside my apartment. There was no one there, no sign that anyone had knocked. But the moment I stepped back inside, I felt it, that presence, that same feeling from the gas station, the one I couldn't shake. It was like the air in the room had thickened, like I wasn't alone anymore. I slammed the door shut, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But deep down, I knew better. The knocking, the heaviness, it had followed me. That night, I barely slept. Every sound in the apartment seemed amplified, like the creak of the floorboards, the soft hum of the refrigerator, even the wind against the window. Every noise made me sit up, eyes wide, waiting for the knocking to start again. But it didn't. Not that night. The second time was worse. A few days later, I woke up around 2 a.m. for no particular reason. Just one of those moments where your body jerks awake out of nowhere. The apartment was dark, the kind of darkness that feels thick, like you could reach out and touch it. I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake the grogginess, when I heard it again, the knock. 3 slow, deliberate taps. But this time, it wasn't coming from the front door. It was coming from inside the apartment. I shot up in bed, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. My eyes darted around the room, scanning the shadows, trying to pinpoint where the sound had come from. The knocking came again, this time louder. 3 knocks, coming from the other side of my bedroom wall. I wanted to believe it was just the neighbors. Old buildings like mine, you can hear things through the walls, right? That's what I told myself as I sat there, clutching the blanket, too terrified to move. But I knew better. This was different. The pattern of the knocks, the deliberate pauses between them, it was the same as at the gas station. I didn't sleep after that. I just sat there in the dark, waiting, listening for more sounds. But the apartment stayed silent. It wasn't until the first light of morning crept through the blinds that I finally managed to calm down. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe I was just paranoid, letting my mind get the best of me. That's what I kept telling myself. But when I went to make coffee that morning, something happened that almost made me drop the cup. As soon as I stepped into the kitchen, I smelled it, coffee. Freshly brewed coffee. The scent filled the room, and my stomach dropped. I didn't have a coffee machine. Not anymore. I had thrown mine out months ago because it had broken, and I hadn't bothered to replace it. The smell of coffee was unmistakable, though. Rich, warm, fresh. But there was no source, no machine bubbling away in the corner. I stood there, paralyzed, as the scent slowly faded, leaving behind only the creeping chill in the pit of my stomach. I backed out of the kitchen, feeling dizzy, feeling like I was losing control. I thought about the coffee machine at the gas station, the one Greg had warned me about, the one I wasn't supposed to use. The smell that lingered in my apartment now felt like a warning, like a connection to that place, and I didn't know what to do. The days passed, but the fear never left. Every knock, every strange sound made my heart race. My apartment, my safe space, had turned into a place I didn't trust. I started sleeping with the lights on, hoping that would help. It didn't. And then the third night happened. It was around 2:15 a.m., the same time I'd heard the knocks at the gas station. I was sitting on my bed, too wired to sleep, staring at my phone when it rang. The moment the screen lit up, I froze. The caller ID said, "Unknown." My heart leapt into my throat. The rules had been clear. Never answer the phone between 2 a.m. and 3:33 a.m. I had followed the rules at the gas station, but now the call was coming to me, to my home. My hand hovered over the phone, torn between answering it and letting it ring. But the longer it rang, the more the tension in the room thickened, like the air itself was holding its breath. Finally, with trembling fingers, I declined the call. The phone went silent. For a moment I thought it was over, but then a notification popped up. Voicemail. I stared at it, my stomach twisting into knots. I didn't want to listen to it, but some part of me, maybe the part that still hoped this was all some kind of bizarre prank, couldn't help it. With shaking hands I hit play. At first, there was nothing, just silence. But then I heard it, that same voice, faint and distorted, barely more than a whisper. It was calling my name. Ben, Ben, come outside. I dropped the phone, my skin crawling. It was the same voice I had heard through the phone at the gas station. But how? How had it found me here? I stumbled back, my mind racing. I felt that same heaviness, that same oppressive presence that I had felt at the gas station. Only this time, it was stronger, closer. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see if she was there, but I couldn't help it. Slowly, I turned toward the window, my heart hammering in my chest. And there she was, the woman in red. She stood outside my window, her black, empty eyes staring straight at me, her face expressionless. The same red dress, the same cold presence. She didn't move, she didn't need to. Her gaze held me in place, like I was trapped, unable to breathe, unable to think. I stumbled back, tripping over the edge of the bed, and when I looked up again, she was gone. The apartment felt silent, but not in a good way. It felt like the quiet after a storm, when everything is waiting to settle. I couldn't stay there anymore. I packed a bag that night and left. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay in that apartment, not with her there. I never went back. I found a new place in the city, a small studio with constant noise, constant people. I thought that maybe the chaos would drown out whatever had followed me. But sometimes late at night, when the streets go quiet and the city starts to sleep, I hear it. The knocking, it never really leaves. My wife Claire and I bought the house a few years ago. It was a charming, old two-story home on the edge of town, quiet, isolated, with lots of trees around the property. It had that kind of character you just don't find in modern homes anymore. You know, big wooden doors, creaky floorboards, rooms that felt lived in. We thought it was perfect. I remember the first night we moved in. The air was crisp, one of those late autumn nights where the wind rattles the windows just enough to make you feel a little uneasy, but not enough to really scare you. Claire was upstairs unpacking, and I was downstairs in the living room, trying to get the old fireplace going. I kept hearing creaks from upstairs, footsteps that I assumed were hers, until I called out to her and realized she was in the bathroom the whole time. I brushed it off as old house noises. But it didn't stop there. A couple of weeks later, Claire and I were sitting in the living room, watching a movie. We were both kind of half asleep on the couch, wrapped up in blankets, when I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. Just a flicker at first, but it was enough to snap me fully awake. I turned my head toward the hallway, expecting to see our cat or something. But no. The hallway was dark, empty. I didn't mention it to Claire. I didn't want to spook her, and frankly, I wasn't even sure what I had seen. Maybe it was just a shadow, a trick of the light. At least that's what I told myself. But the next night, Claire saw her too. We were sitting at the kitchen table, finishing up dinner. It was one of those quiet nights where neither of us was talking much, just enjoying the silence. Claire stood up to clear the plates, and that's when she froze, her eyes locked on the far side of the room, her face pale. "Did you see that?" she whispered, her voice shaky. I followed her gaze, but all I saw was the doorway that led to the hallway. "See what?" "A little girl?" "I swear, I just saw a little girl run past the doorway." My heart skipped a beat. A little girl? I hadn't seen anything, but something about the way Claire said it, the fear in her voice, made my skin crawl. I stood up and checked the hallway. Nothing. No one. Claire was convinced she'd seen something, but I didn't know what to say. "It was probably just your imagination," I told her, trying to calm her down. But inside, I wasn't so sure. I had seen something too, hadn't I? I just didn't want to admit it. That night, as we lay in bed, the house felt heavier, like the air was thick with something we couldn't name. Every creak, every gust of wind outside seemed magnified. I kept telling myself it was just an old house settling, that we were both just tired, but deep down, I knew something was off. Over the next few days, things escalated. The girl, if that's what she was, started appearing more often. Claire saw her first, standing in the hallway, just out of the corner of her eye. A flash of a small figure, no older than 8 or 9, with dark hair and a pale face. She was always gone the second we tried to focus on her, like she was slipping in and out of our world. At first, I thought maybe Claire was just seeing things. After all, we were both stressed from the move, adjusting to a new home. But then I saw her too. One night, I was downstairs by myself, grabbing a glass of water, when I saw movement in the reflection of the kitchen window. I turned quickly, and there she was, standing in the doorway. Just a little girl. Dark hair, old-fashioned clothes, standing perfectly still. My heart stopped. I couldn't breathe. I blinked and she was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't tell Claire either. What was I supposed to say? That I'd seen a ghost? I didn't even believe in that kind of thing, but here we were, both seeing the same thing. Things got worse after that. The girl started appearing more frequently, always in the same spots, standing in doorways, watching us from the shadows, always just out of sight. We'd hear her too. Footsteps, soft and quick, like she was running up and down the stairs when we weren't looking. But there was never anyone there. And then there was something else. It was subtle at first. A strange feeling that we were being watched, but not by the girl. This was different. It was darker, heavier. I'd be sitting on the couch, and I'd feel it, like someone was watching me from the far corner of the room, just outside the reach of the light. It was like the air changed when it was around, thickened somehow, like the room got colder. I didn't say anything to Claire at first. I didn't want to scare her, but then she started mentioning it too. She'd feel it when she was alone in the house, like there was something tall, something huge, watching her from the shadows. It never showed itself fully, but we both knew it was there, lurking, waiting. The more we saw the girl, the stronger that feeling became. It was like whatever was watching us was getting closer, like it was tied to her somehow. Maybe it had always been there, hidden in the background, but now it was starting to show itself. One night, everything came to a head. It was late, past midnight, and Claire and I were both in bed. The wind outside was howling, rattling the old windows. The house felt cold, colder than it should have been. I was half asleep when I heard it. Footsteps, soft but deliberate, coming from the hallway. I lay there, frozen, listening as they got closer and closer to the bedroom door. Claire shifted beside me, waking up. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, the door creaked open. We both sat up, our eyes fixed on the doorway. And there she was, the little girl, standing in the hallway, her pale face barely visible in the dim light. But this time, something was different. She wasn't alone. Behind her, standing in the shadows, was a figure. Tall, impossibly tall, its outline barely distinguishable in the darkness. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but we could feel its presence. It was like the air in the room had been sucked out, replaced with something thick and suffocating. Claire gasped, clutching my arm. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't know what to say. I couldn't take my eyes off the figure. It felt like it was watching us, waiting for something. And then the girl smiled. It was subtle, just a slight twitch of her lips, but it sent chills down my spine. She stepped forward, and as she did, the tall figure seemed to recede, fading into the darkness behind her. I wanted to move, to get up, to do something, but I was frozen in place. Claire was gripping my arm so tightly it hurt, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the girl. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they were gone. The door creaked shut, and the room was silent again. Neither of us slept that night. The next morning, we decided we couldn't stay in the house any longer. We packed up a few essentials and left, staying with a friend while we figured out what to do. We couldn't explain what had happened, and we didn't try. We just knew we couldn't go back. We moved out a week later, sold the house to a young couple who seemed excited about the charm of the old place. We didn't tell them what we'd seen. I'm not sure they would have believed us if we had. But sometimes, late at night, I still think about that house, about the girl, and about the tall figure that watched us from the shadows. I wonder if they're still there, waiting for someone else to notice them. We moved out of that house as quickly as we could. It wasn't easy, emotionally or financially, but we couldn't live there anymore. Not after what we'd seen, what we felt lingering in those dark corners, just beyond our reach. We didn't want to risk waiting until something worse happened. Claire and I told ourselves it was for our sanity, our safety, and honestly, to protect whatever was left of our marriage after living with that terror for months. You'd think once we left, things would get better, right? Like we could finally breathe again, sleep without waking up at 3 a.m., hearts pounding, expecting to see those pale eyes staring back at us from the doorway. But leaving wasn't the end. Not for me, at least. We sold the house to that couple a week later. They were young, optimistic, talking about starting a family there. I wanted to warn them, to tell them everything, but what could I say? Hey, by the way, there's a ghostly little girl and something tall, something worse, that watches you at night. They'd think we were crazy or just trying to scare them off. So I kept my mouth shut. I've regretted it ever since. For a while, things were normal. Or at least as normal as they could be after everything. Claire and I rented a small apartment closer to the city. It was bland and sterile, nothing like the charm of that old house, but it felt safe. We were surrounded by neighbors, constant noise from the streets, life moving around us. It felt like maybe, just maybe, we could put it all behind us. But the problem was, the memories didn't stay behind. They followed me. Everywhere. It started with the dreams. The first one came a few nights after we moved into the apartment. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. The image of that tall figure burned into my mind. In the dream, I was back in the old house, standing in the hallway, staring at the open door to our bedroom. The little girl was there, as always, but this time she wasn't alone. The figure was standing behind her, closer than it had ever been. Its presence felt suffocating, like the air itself was pressing down on me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I just stood there, paralyzed, watching as the figure leaned down, its shadowy form towering over the girl. And then, for the first time, it spoke. "You shouldn't have left." The voice was low, distorted, barely more than a whisper, but it was enough to jolt me awake. I sat up in bed, gasping for air, my body trembling. Claire was still asleep beside me, completely unaware of the nightmare I'd just had. I didn't wake her. What could I say? That the house, the thing in that house, was still haunting me. I wanted to believe it was just a dream, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The dreams kept coming. Night after night, the same scene. I'd be back in the house, always in the hallway, always staring at the girl and the figure. Each time the figure got closer, more distinct. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It had form now, tall, gaunt, with long arms that stretched unnaturally, reaching out toward me. And each time it whispered the same words, "You shouldn't have left." During the day, I tried to push the dreams out of my mind. I went to work, spent time with Claire, did everything I could to move on. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Even in the apartment, where I should have felt safe, I'd catch glimpses of movement in the corner of my eye, shadows that seemed to linger just a little too long, footsteps in the hall when no one else was home. Claire didn't notice anything, or if she did, she didn't mention it. She seemed to be doing better, sleeping through the night, smiling more. Maybe she'd been able to leave it all behind. Maybe the house hadn't gotten its hooks into her the way it had with me. But me, I was unraveling. One night after another nightmare, I couldn't take it anymore. I got up, quietly left the bedroom, and sat in the living room in the dark. The city lights outside flickered through the curtains, casting strange shadows on the walls. I was exhausted, physically and mentally, but I couldn't sleep. Not with the constant feeling that something was waiting for me to close my eyes. I sat there for what felt like hours, my mind racing when I felt it, that presence. The same one from the house. It was faint at first, like a cold breeze brushing against the back of my neck. I sat up straighter, my pulse quickening. The room was still, completely silent, but the feeling was unmistakable. That weight, that heaviness pressing down on me. I wasn't alone. Slowly, I turned my head toward the hallway, expecting to see nothing, hoping to see nothing. But there, standing in the dim light at the far end of the hall, was the girl. My breath caught in my throat. She was just standing there, her dark hair falling in front of her face, her small figure barely visible in the shadows. For a moment I thought I was still dreaming, that maybe I hadn't really woken up at all. But no, this was real. And then I saw it. Behind her, towering in the shadows, was the figure. I froze, unable to move, unable to think. It was exactly like the dreams, only this time I was awake. The figure stood behind the girl, its long arms stretching out toward her, its body distorted and unnatural. I could feel its eyes, if it even had eyes, watching me from the darkness. For a moment, everything was silent, and then the girl spoke. "Why did you leave us?" Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it echoed in the stillness of the room. My blood turned to ice. Us? There was more than just her, the figure, the thing that had been following me. They were connected. They always had been. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. My throat was dry, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The girl took a step forward, and the figure followed, its presence filling the room with a cold, oppressive weight. "You shouldn't have left," the figure whispered, its voice low and guttural, like something from deep underground. I couldn't take it anymore. I jumped up from the couch, my legs trembling, and bolted down the hallway toward the bedroom. I slammed the door shut behind me, waking Claire in the process. "What's going on?" she asked, sitting up, her voice groggy with sleep. "I saw her," I gasped, my back pressed against the door. "The girl and the thing. They were here." Claire stared at me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she said something that chilled me to my core. "I've been seeing them too." My mind raced. Claire had seen them. She hadn't said a word, hadn't acted like anything was wrong. But now, as I looked at her, I realized the truth. She'd been seeing the girl and the figure this whole time, just like I had. She hadn't left it behind either. That was when I knew we couldn't escape it. The house, the girl, the figure, they weren't tied to the place. They were tied to us. It's been a few months now, and the sightings haven't stopped. They follow us, no matter where we go. Sometimes the girl appears in broad daylight, standing in the corner of a room, watching us with those empty eyes. Other times, it's just the figure, a shadowy presence lurking in the dark, always just out of sight, but never far away. We've tried everything. We've moved again, even stayed with friends, but it doesn't matter. They always find us. I don't know how to make it stop. I don't know what they want. But every time I see them, I hear those same words. "You shouldn't have left." And I think, maybe they're right. Maybe the only way to end this is to go back, to return to the house. But I don't know what will happen if we do. That's where it all started for me. Little things that were easy to brush off at first. But now, looking back, I realize I should have paid more attention. Maybe if I had, things wouldn't have gotten so out of control. It was a normal day, nothing unusual at all. My wife, Megan, and I had just moved into a new house, a cozy little place in a quiet neighborhood. It was the kind of house we'd always dreamed of. A modest 2-story, big windows, a nice backyard with plenty of space for summer barbecues. It felt like the perfect place to settle down. The first couple of weeks were peaceful, unpacking boxes, setting up furniture, figuring out which rooms we wanted to use for what. It felt good, like a fresh start. But then, the odd things started happening. The first time I noticed something strange was about a month after we moved in. I was in the kitchen, making coffee, when I thought I saw something move outside the window. It was quick, just a flicker of motion in the yard. I figured it was a squirrel or maybe a neighbor's kid running through. But then it happened again a few days later. Only this time, I got a better look. It was a figure, a small one, like a child. At first I thought maybe it was just the neighbor's kid, but something felt off about the way it moved. It was too fast, too smooth, like it wasn't really walking, but gliding. I didn't say anything to Megan about it. I didn't want to freak her out, and besides, I wasn't even sure what I'd seen, but the sightings didn't stop. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing the figure more often. Always out of the corner of my eye, always disappearing as soon as I tried to focus on it. I'd be sitting on the couch, watching TV, and I'd catch a glimpse of movement outside the window. Or I'd be upstairs in the bedroom, and I'd see it flash by the hallway mirror, like someone running down the stairs. Every time my heart would skip a beat, and I'd feel this cold, creeping sensation crawl up my spine. But every time, when I went to check, there was nothing there. Then Megan saw her. I remember the night like it was yesterday. We were sitting in the living room, enjoying a quiet evening after dinner. Megan was reading, and I was flipping through channels on the TV, trying to find something to watch. Suddenly, she froze, the book slipping from her hands. I noticed her eyes go wide as she stared out the window, her face paling in an instant. "What's wrong?" I asked, turning to look out the window myself, but I didn't see anything. She shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I saw a little girl." My stomach dropped. "A girl? Outside?" Megan nodded slowly. "Yeah, just for a second. She was standing in the yard, staring at the house, but when I looked again, she was gone." I tried to play it off, telling her it was probably just one of the neighborhood kids, or maybe even a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew exactly what she was talking about. I'd been seeing the same thing for weeks, but I hadn't wanted to admit it. Now that Megan had seen her too, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was really wrong. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. Who was this girl? Why was she hanging around our house? Was it just some weird coincidence, or was something more sinister going on? The questions kept swirling in my head, but I didn't have any answers. And the more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. The sightings became more frequent after that. Both Megan and I started seeing the girl almost daily. Sometimes she was outside, standing at the edge of the yard, just staring up at the house. Other times, we'd catch glimpses of her inside the house, just a fleeting shadow moving down the hallway or a reflection in the glass. It was like she was everywhere, yet nowhere at the same time. We couldn't get a good look at her, but we both knew it was the same figure, the same little girl. It wasn't just the sightings that were getting to us, though. There was something else, something darker. The house felt different. The air inside was always heavy, like it was thick with tension. At night, the temperature would drop sharply, even though it was summer. I'd wake up shivering, drenched in cold sweat, even though the thermostat was set to normal. And the dreams, oh God, the dreams. Both Megan and I started having these terrible nightmares, always featuring the same little girl. In my dreams, she'd be standing at the foot of our bed, her face hidden in shadow, her head tilted like she was listening to something only she could hear. I couldn't see her clearly, but I knew she was staring at us, and I knew she wanted something from us. But every time I tried to move or speak, I'd wake up, heart racing, cold air swirling around me, and Megan gasping awake beside me. It was driving us both to the edge. We couldn't escape her, not in our waking lives, and not even in our sleep. One night, things escalated. Megan and I were in bed, trying to sleep, though it felt impossible. The house was so still, but there was this underlying hum of tension in the air, like the calm before a storm. Around 3 a.m., I woke up suddenly. No reason, no noise, just that feeling in my chest, like someone was in the room with us. I looked around, my heart pounding, and that's when I saw her. The girl was standing in the doorway of our bedroom, just standing there. Her figure was faint, almost like she was fading in and out of reality. But I could see her. I could feel her presence. She was staring directly at me, her eyes dark and hollow, like empty sockets. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I wanted to scream, to wake Megan, but I couldn't move. It was like my body had been paralyzed by fear. The girl took a step forward, slowly, almost hesitantly. My heart was racing, my mind screaming at me to do something, but I couldn't move. I just lay there, staring at her, waiting for her to get closer. And then, she vanished. Just like that, she was gone. One moment she was there, and the next, the doorway was empty. I gasped, sitting up in bed, shaking Megan awake. She blinked groggily, confused, until I told her what I'd seen. "I saw her too," Megan whispered, her voice trembling. "In my dream. She was standing right there, watching us." We sat there in the darkness, both of us too scared to move, too terrified to close our eyes. There was no denying it anymore. This wasn't just some trick of the mind. We were both seeing her, and she was getting bolder, coming closer. The next morning, we decided to look into the house's history. We needed answers. Something to explain who this girl was and why she was haunting us. We spent hours digging through old records, trying to find anything about the previous owners. That's when we stumbled upon an old newspaper article from the 1970s. The headline read, "Tragedy Strikes, Young Girl Drowns in Neighbor's Pool." The story was brief. A little girl, no older than 8, had drowned in the pool of the house next door. She'd been playing outside, unsupervised, and somehow slipped into the pool. By the time anyone noticed, it was too late. She died right there, just a few feet from our house. The worst part, the house we lived in had been her home. That revelation sent chills down my spine. It all made sense now. The girl we'd been seeing wasn't just some random apparition. She was tied to this place. She died here, and for some reason, she hadn't moved on. We thought knowing the truth might give us some peace, but it didn't. If anything, it made things worse. The sightings became more intense after that, like she knew we were getting closer to understanding. We'd see her more often, and not just outside the house. She'd appear in the kitchen, the bathroom, the hallway, always watching, always waiting. We didn't know what to do. How do you get rid of a ghost? We considered moving, but we just bought the house. We couldn't afford to leave, so we decided to confront her. Maybe if we acknowledged her, if we talked to her, she'd leave us alone. That was our hope, anyway. One evening, Megan and I stood in the living room, holding hands, calling out to the girl. We told her we knew who she was, that we understood what had happened. We asked her what she wanted, why she was still here. The room felt heavy, the air thick and cold, but nothing happened. No response, no sign. Until that night, we were lying in bed, the lights off, trying to sleep, when I felt it. A presence. Not like before, though. This time it felt different. Closer. I opened my eyes, and there she was, standing at the foot of the bed, staring at us. But something was different this time. She wasn't alone. Beside her stood a man. Taller, darker. I couldn't make out his face, but his presence was overwhelming. It felt suffocating, like the air had been sucked out of the room. Megan gasped, sitting up beside me, her eyes wide with terror. She saw them too. And then as quickly as they appeared, they were gone. Just gone. No warning, no sound. But the room was still heavy with their presence. That was the last time we saw the girl. But the man, we never figured out who he was or why he was with her. But I think about him sometimes, especially on nights when the house feels too quiet. Have you ever worked in a place so normal, so ordinary, that you start believing it's just safe? You know, like nothing out of the ordinary could ever happen there? That's how I felt about my job when I started working at the White Rose Hotel. Just your typical night shift at the front desk, clean lobby, dim lighting, the steady hum of the air conditioning, and the occasional late-night guest. That was it. No drama, no excitement, and certainly no terror. But after 2 years at the White Rose, I can tell you with absolute certainty, there are things in that hotel that no one talks about. And after what I've experienced, I'll never forget the things I've seen. Some of it, well, it still keeps me up at night. It started with the knocks. You see, the hotel has been around since the 1920s, though it's been renovated several times since. Still, something about the place feels old, like it's holding on to some history that just doesn't want to let go. Most of the time, I worked the night shift alone. It wasn't usually busy at night, just a couple of guests coming in late or people leaving in the early hours to catch a flight. I liked the quiet. It gave me time to catch up on reading or zone out, maybe even get a nap in. But then a few months ago, I started hearing things. At first, it was subtle, just small, random knocks coming from the hallways late at night. At first, I brushed it off. Old building, right? Pipes or something. Maybe a guest being clumsy. But these knocks, they kept happening. And they were too regular, too purposeful. I remember the first night it got to me. It was just past 2 a.m. I was sitting at the front desk, scrolling through my phone, trying to keep my eyes open. That's when I heard the knock again. 3 sharp, rhythmic taps on the wall behind me. I turned around, expecting to see a guest standing there, but nothing. I walked around to the back of the counter to see if maybe someone had knocked on the wall and left. Still nothing. The hallway was empty. The lobby, dead quiet. I shrugged it off, figured I was just tired. But after that, the knocks became more frequent, and it wasn't just behind me. Some nights, I'd hear them coming from the hallway on the second floor, where the guests' rooms were. Other nights, they'd be near the elevator. Always 3 knocks, always sharp, always the same pattern. But no one was ever there. And then the incident started. You'd think that would be the kind of thing that makes headlines, right? But no, the hotel kept it all hush-hush. I don't know how they managed it, but somehow it stayed quiet. Still, you can't work in a place where multiple strange things happen and not feel like something's off. The first incident happened a little over a year ago. A man, late 40s, checked into room 213. He seemed normal, quiet, polite, nothing out of the ordinary. 2 days later, the housekeeper found him in the shower, passed out. The management treated it like an isolated incident. These things happen, they said. People sometimes have personal problems or reasons we don't know. But a month later, a woman in her mid-30s checked into room 315. 2 nights after that, she was found unconscious in the bathtub, with no clear reason why. Same thing, no explanation. After that, it became hard to ignore. People started whispering. Staff were talking about it in hushed tones, wondering what was drawing people to the hotel to have these strange episodes. And that's when the weird stuff really started happening. I wasn't the only one hearing the knocks anymore. Guests started complaining. They'd come down in the morning and ask if someone had been knocking on their doors in the middle of the night. Of course, we checked the cameras. Nothing. Just empty hallways. Guests in rooms 213 and 315, those specific rooms, always reported strange things. Knocking, footsteps, even voices. One guest swore up and down that someone was breathing right behind her while she was trying to sleep. But the worst part? Room 409. One night, a guest, a businessman, early 50s, clean cut, no nonsense, checked in late. He seemed a little frazzled, but I didn't think much of it. People come in late from flights all the time. He asked for a room on one of the higher floors, so I gave him 409. Around 3 a.m., just as I was about to take a break, he came running down the stairs, sweat pouring down his face, his eyes wide with fear. He was shaking so bad he could barely talk. I thought maybe he'd had a panic attack or something. When I finally got him to calm down, he told me what happened. He said he'd been lying in bed, about to drift off, when he heard someone knocking on his door. 3 sharp knocks. He assumed it was room service or maybe a late-night visitor, so he got up to check. But when he opened the door, no one was there. He shrugged it off, thinking he'd imagined it. He went back to bed. But then, he saw him. He said he turned over in bed, and there, standing in the corner of the room, was a man. Just standing. Not moving, not saying anything. Just staring. The guest described him as tall, with dark hair, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, like something out of the 1930s. And his face was pale, almost gray, with sunken eyes. The guest bolted out of the room without even grabbing his stuff. He demanded to be moved to another hotel immediately. I didn't even argue. I just called him a cab and sent him on his way. After that, I had to go check room 409. I didn't want to, but I couldn't just leave it like that. When I got to the room, I felt, I don't know, cold. Not like the AC kind of cold. It was deeper, like the cold was coming from inside the walls. The air was thick, like it was pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. I stood there for a minute, staring at the corner where the guest said he'd seen the man. Nothing, just an empty room. But still, I felt it, that heaviness, like I wasn't alone. That was the first time I saw him. As I was about to leave, I caught something out of the corner of my eye. A movement, just a shadow, but enough to stop me in my tracks. I turned and looked into the bathroom mirror, and there, reflected in the glass, was the figure. He wasn't in the room, but he was there, in the mirror. Just like the guest had said, tall, old-fashioned clothes, pale face, sunken eyes, and he was staring right at me. I ran. I didn't even lock the door. I just left the room and went straight down to the lobby. I spent the rest of the night sitting behind the desk, my heart pounding, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The next morning, I told the manager what had happened. He just nodded like he'd heard it all before. "It's been happening for years," he said, "ever since the first strange incident. Turns out, there was a story no one likes to talk about. Back in the 1930s, a man had stayed in the hotel, room 409. He was down on his luck, jobless, penniless, and his wife had just left him. One night, something happened in that room, and ever since then, people who stay in that room see him. Sometimes he knocks, sometimes he just stands in the corner, but he's always there. I didn't last long after that. I couldn't stay there, not knowing what was lurking in the shadows. But the worst part, even after I left, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching. Even now, when I'm alone at night, I swear I hear those 3 knocks, like he's still trying to find a way out. But the thing is, I don't think he ever will, and neither will the others. It's been a few months since I quit the job at the White Rose Hotel, and you'd think I'd be able to move on by now. But it's not that simple. Some nights I wake up in a cold sweat, certain I can hear those same 3 knocks, sharp and deliberate, echoing in my bedroom. But when I turn on the lights, nothing's there. I've tried telling myself it's just the stress, just my mind playing tricks on me. But there's this part of me, this deep, gnawing feeling, that knows it's something more. It's almost as if the hotel doesn't want to let me go. You might think I'm crazy, but I swear to you, things followed me from that place. It's in the small details, the things you wouldn't notice if you weren't paying attention. It started with my phone. A few weeks after I left, I was scrolling through my contacts, trying to find an old coworker's number. That's when I saw it, a new contact saved under the name 409. No last name, no details, just those 3 numbers. I don't know how it got there. I never saved anything like that, and when I opened it up, the phone number field was empty. No calls, no texts, just the contact. I deleted it, of course. Thought it was some kind of glitch, but then it came back. The next night I checked again, and there it was, 409, sitting there in my contacts like it had never left. This time I didn't delete it. I just turned off my phone and tried to forget about it. But the more I tried to push it out of my head, the more I felt like I was being watched. Like no matter where I went, something was keeping an eye on me. That's when I started dreaming about the hotel. At first, they were just flashes, me standing at the front desk, the lobby dark and empty. But over time, the dreams became more vivid, more real. I'd find myself walking through the hallways, the carpet soft under my feet, the air heavy like it had been in room 409. In these dreams, I always end up at the same place, the door to room 409. It's just a door, nothing special. But in the dream, my hand always reaches for the handle, like I'm being pulled toward it. Every time, I wake up before I open it. But a few nights ago, something different happened. I was having the same dream, walking down the hall toward room 409. The lights were flickering, and I could hear that familiar knocking sound in the distance. I reached the door, my hand trembling as I went to grab the knob, but this time, I wasn't alone. I felt a presence behind me, cold and looming. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't dare turn around, but I could feel it. It was him. I knew it. The man from the hotel, the one people see in the mirror. I could feel his breath on the back of my neck, like he was just inches away waiting for me to move. My heart was pounding in my chest, every instinct in my body screaming at me to run, but I couldn't. I was frozen. Then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I heard it. The voice. low and gravelly, like it hadn't been used in decades. "You never should have left." I jolted awake, my body drenched in sweat, my pulse racing. It was just a dream, right? Just a nightmare. But then I heard it, the knock. 3 sharp taps coming from the hallway outside my apartment. I sat up in bed, every muscle tense, listening. There it was again. I thought maybe it was a neighbor, but it sounded too close, too deliberate. It was the same pattern, the same sound I'd heard night after night at the hotel. I didn't move for what felt like hours. I just sat there, staring at the door, waiting for something to happen. Eventually, the knocking stopped, but the fear, that stayed. I don't know what he wants. I don't know why he's followed me, but I can feel him, lurking in the shadows, waiting. And I think, deep down, I know what's coming. The hotel isn't finished with me. It never was. You don't just walk away from a place like that, not without something following you. Last night it happened again. I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, when my phone lit up. I reached over to check it, and there, on the screen, was a notification. Missed call from 409. I didn't pick it up. I didn't dare. But I know what I have to do now. I have to go back. I have to return to the White Rose Hotel. Because whatever's waiting for me there, it's not going to stop until I do. I'm going back tonight. I don't know what's going to happen, but I have to find out. I can't live like this anymore. With the constant knocking, the dreams, the feeling that I'm being watched, it's like the hotel has a hold on me, pulling me back. And maybe that's what it wanted all along. The lights are always dim in the White Rose Hotel, no matter the time of day. As soon as I step inside, I can feel the weight of the place pressing down on me, like it's alive, like it's been waiting for me to return. The front desk looks the same as always, but the air is thick with that cold, suffocating chill that I remember all too well. I head straight to the elevator, not even bothering to check in. Room 409 is where I'm going. It's always been waiting for me. When I step off the elevator, the hallway feels different, quieter, darker. And then, as I approach room 409, I hear it again, the knocks. 3 sharp taps echoing through the silence. I stand in front of the door, my hand hovering over the handle, my heart pounding in my chest. This time, I'm not dreaming. This time, I'm going to open the door. With a deep breath, I turn the handle and step inside. And that's when I see him. He's standing in the corner, just like before, tall and shadowed, his face hidden in the dim light. But this time, he moves. Slowly, he turns to face me, his eyes empty, his presence cold and suffocating. I can't move, I can't breathe. And then he speaks. "Welcome back." I'm not sure what happened after that. I woke up this morning, back in my own bed, my heart still racing, my body drenched in sweat. But something's changed. The knocking, it stopped. The dreams, they're gone. It's like the hotel finally let me go. But there's one thing I can't shake. When I checked my phone this morning, there was a new contact saved. No name this time, just a number. 409. I'm going to tell you something that's been on my mind for weeks now. I haven't shared it with anyone, not even my closest friends. It sounds insane, but every time I close my eyes, I'm reminded of it. You know when you just know something's off, but you can't explain why? That's how I felt. It all started with my dog, Ollie. Now, Ollie's a great dog. Loyal, a little too energetic at times, but always friendly and never really the type to act weird. He's a mix of German Shepherd and something else, maybe Lab, I'm not sure, but he's got that intelligent, observant look. The kind that makes you wonder if dogs really do see more than we do. Anyway, it was a few weeks back. I'd gotten into this routine of staying up late. Not intentionally, it's just that work was crazy, and I was doing a lot of overtime, so I'd find myself on the couch until 2 or 3 in the morning most nights, watching whatever was on. Ollie, like clockwork, would usually sit next to me, dozing off, occasionally lifting his head if he heard something interesting. You know, normal dog behavior. But then he started doing this thing that I can't shake from my head. It began subtle at first. Every now and then, around midnight, I'd catch him staring at the door to my bedroom. At first, I thought nothing of it. Dogs do weird things, right? Maybe he heard a noise or smelled something that caught his attention. So I ignored it. But then, it kept happening. One night, I was half watching some dumb show when I noticed Ollie again, stiff, sitting on his haunches, eyes fixed on that door. He wasn't blinking, wasn't moving, just staring. I called his name, waved my hand in front of his face, but he didn't react. His breathing had this strange, shallow rhythm to it, like he was holding back from growling. That's when I felt the first little prick of unease. I chalked it up to him being weird, though. Dogs can be weird, right? But it got worse. The next night, same thing. Midnight, and there Ollie was again, staring at the door, only this time his ears were back, flattened against his head. I got up, walked over to the door, opened it wide just to show him there was nothing there. I turned on the light, even went inside, waving my arms like a maniac, just to prove it to myself as much as him that nothing was out of place. But the moment I sat down, he resumed staring, and then he started whimpering. That low, soft whine that dogs do when they're anxious, like something's not right. His tail was tucked between his legs, and he wouldn't stop staring. It was like he could see something that I couldn't. The temperature in the room dropped. No, I'm not exaggerating. I felt it. It was like someone had opened a window and let the winter air rush in. But when I checked, everything was shut tight. I started to feel that creeping sensation, like someone's standing right behind you. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself it was just my imagination, but my skin was crawling, and I felt this pressure in my chest. Ollie, he wouldn't stop. His whimpering got louder, his body was shaking. I swear I've never seen him like that before. At that point, I was pretty freaked out, but I didn't want to admit it to myself, so I did the logical thing. I called in an expert, some local guy who checks houses for, strange things. I didn't know what I expected him to find, but I was desperate for an explanation. He came by the next morning, did a thorough sweep, and told me the house was clean. No mold, no gas leaks, no electromagnetic fields, nothing. He smiled at me like I was overreacting and said maybe Ollie was just picking up on some stray noises or had a bad experience I wasn't aware of. I wanted to believe him, so I did for a while. But then came that night, the night that's been haunting me ever since. It was colder than usual, and the wind outside was howling, rattling the windows. There was a storm rolling in, and the whole atmosphere felt thick, like the air was too heavy. Ollie had been jumpy all day, and by the time night fell, he was glued to my side. His eyes darted toward the door every few minutes, but he wouldn't leave my feet. I was trying to ignore it, pretending I wasn't as freaked out as I was, but the tension was eating away at me. It was around 1 a.m. when it happened. I was drifting off on the couch, the TV humming in the background. Suddenly, Ollie shot up, barking like mad, his fur bristling. He charged toward the bedroom door and then stopped dead, his paws skidding on the floor. He stood there, growling, this deep, menacing sound that seemed to vibrate in my chest. I've never heard him growl like that. I sat up, heart pounding. My first thought was that someone had broken in. But then, I looked. The door was open, wide open, even though I was sure I'd shut it before. The room beyond was dark, unnaturally dark, as if the shadows were deeper than they should be. I don't know how to explain it, but something was wrong with the darkness in there. Ollie wouldn't move. His growling got louder, more desperate. I grabbed the flashlight from the table, my hands shaking so badly that I could barely switch it on. I pointed the light toward the door, into the darkness, and for a second, just a split second, I thought I saw something. A shape, just barely visible, moving deeper into the shadows. It was tall, unnaturally tall, with a twisted, hunched form that didn't look human. I froze. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't even scream. Ollie was barking now, ferociously, but he wouldn't step forward. He stayed rooted to the spot, as if some invisible barrier was keeping him from going any closer. And then, just like that, the shape was gone. The room was normal again. The shadows were just shadows, and the air seemed to lighten. I didn't move for what felt like hours, just sitting there with the flashlight aimed at the door, my mind racing. Ollie finally stopped barking, but he stayed tense, his eyes locked on the door like he was waiting for it to come back. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The next day, I called my brother, told him what happened. He came over, checked the place top to bottom, and found nothing. I wanted to believe him when he said it was probably just my imagination, but I saw it. I know what I saw. After that, things quieted down for a while. Ollie's behavior went back to normal, and I thought maybe it was all just some strange one-time event. Maybe the storm had messed with my head. But last night it started again. Ollie's been staring at the door for hours, just like before. Only this time, there's no storm, there's no reason. He won't stop growling, low and quiet, like he knows something's coming. And now I'm sitting here, flashlight in hand, heart racing, waiting for whatever it is to show itself again. And the worst part, this time, I'm not sure if I'll survive seeing it. So yeah, that's what's been happening. I don't know what to do. I don't know if I'm losing my mind, or if there really is something in that room, something that only Ollie can sense. But if you were me, wouldn't you be scared too? I'll tell you the story of Jacob. I know, it's the kind of story that sticks with you, the kind that makes your skin crawl when you think about it later. I was there, and trust me when I say, nothing about it felt right. I still get chills just talking about it. But you need to hear this. Jacob was the adventurous type, a guy who lived for the thrill of the outdoors. He loved to cycle, especially in remote areas, places where the paths weren't clear, and where you'd often find yourself alone for miles. He'd joke about how the isolation gave him a sense of freedom, a chance to disconnect from the chaos of everyday life. The thing is, sometimes isolation has a way of turning on you. It was late October, and the air had that biting chill that clings to you just before winter. Jacob had planned a weekend cycling trip through a dense forest up north, a place that had a reputation for being wild and untamed. It was a mix of rugged terrain, thick woods, and narrow, winding trails that seemed to disappear into the trees. He had been talking about this trip for weeks, and nothing could stop him from going. Not even the warnings about how unpredictable the weather could get up there, or the strange stories people told about the area. He laughed it off. I remember the day he left. The sky was a dull gray, and there was this heavy stillness in the air, like the calm before a storm. Jacob had that usual grin on his face as he threw his gear into the back of his car, telling us we'd hear from him once he got back in a few days. But he never did. That's where everything went wrong. When Jacob didn't return after 3 days, we didn't think much of it at first. Maybe he'd decided to extend his trip or had trouble with his phone. Stuff like that happened all the time in the wilderness. But by the 5th day, the worry set in. We tried calling him, but his phone went straight to voicemail. His family reached out to the local authorities, and within hours, a search team was dispatched. They found his car parked at the trailhead, untouched. His bike was missing, which meant he had started his ride, but that was it. No sign of him. The days that followed were a blur of search efforts. Helicopters scanned the area, volunteers combed through the woods, but there was nothing. No tracks, no signs of struggle, nothing. It was like Jacob had been swallowed by the forest itself. And that's when people started to whisper about the place, about how others had disappeared there before. I decided to join the search after a week. I couldn't just sit around knowing he was out there. The first thing I noticed when I got to the forest was how suffocating it felt. The trees were so thick that even in the middle of the day, the light barely pierced through, casting long, eerie shadows on the ground. The air was damp and heavy with a scent of decay, like something had been left to rot for far too long. The wind made this low, howling sound as it passed through the branches, as if the forest itself was whispering something dark. We split into small groups, each covering different parts of the trail. I remember the unsettling silence that hung in the air. No birds, no animals, just the crunch of leaves under our boots and the occasional crack of a branch in the distance. Every now and then I'd hear something, like the faint sound of footsteps behind me. But every time I turned around, there was nothing there. Just trees and shadows. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Something was out there. By the 3rd day of searching, I was exhausted, but I couldn't shake this feeling that I was being watched. It was subtle at first, like the weight of someone's gaze on the back of my neck. But as the day went on, it became more intense. Every step I took felt like it was being mirrored, like there was someone, or something, right behind me, just out of sight. I'd stop, turn around, but there was never anything there, just that endless wall of trees. Then on the 4th day, something happened. We were deep in the forest, miles away from the main trail. It was late afternoon, and the sun was already starting to dip below the horizon, casting everything in this strange orange glow. We were about to head back when I noticed something, a faint glimmer through the trees. At first I thought it was just the light reflecting off something, but as I got closer, I realized it was metal. Jacob's bike. It was lying on its side, half buried in the dirt and leaves, like it had been there for days. My heart raced as I called out to the others, and we rushed over. But there was no sign of Jacob, just the bike, abandoned in the middle of nowhere. That's when we found the footprints. They were faint, barely visible, but they were there, leading away from the bike, deeper into the forest. We followed them, our pace quickening as the light faded. The trees closed in around us, and the shadows grew longer, twisting into strange shapes that seemed to move on their own. The footprints led us to a clearing, a place that felt wrong. The air was colder here, biting at our skin, and the silence was deafening. In the center of the clearing was a small, dilapidated cabin, the kind that looked like it had been abandoned for decades. The wood was rotting, the windows were shattered, and the door hung off its hinges. But what stood out the most was the smell. It was thick, suffocating, like something had died long ago and had never been found. We approached cautiously, calling out for Jacob, but there was no response. One of the guys pushed open the door, and that's when we saw it. Inside the cabin, the walls were covered in scratches, deep, jagged marks that looked like they had been made by something trying to claw its way out. The floor was littered with old, torn clothes, bones, and something else. In the corner of the room, half hidden in the shadows, was a pile of what looked like hair. Human hair. That's when I saw it, a figure, standing just beyond the trees, watching us. It was tall, thin, and its eyes, they glowed in the fading light. I blinked, and it was gone. My heart pounded in my chest as I stumbled back, yelling for the others, but when they turned to look, there was nothing. Just the trees, swaying in the wind. We left the forest that night. We never found Jacob, and after that, the search was called off. The official story is that he got lost, that the forest took him. But I know better. Something else is out there, something that watches, waits, and takes what it wants. To this day, I can't explain what I saw or what happened in that cabin. All I know is that Jacob didn't just disappear, he was taken. And whatever took him is still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. After we left that cursed forest, life was never quite the same. It wasn't just about losing Jacob, though that loss alone was devastating. It was the lingering feeling that something was unfinished, unresolved. For weeks, I couldn't shake the image of that figure, watching from the trees, its glowing eyes burning into my mind. My sleep was restless, filled with nightmares of that cabin, of scratching sounds, and of Jacob calling out for help, just out of reach. I tried to move on, like the others did. The search was over, after all. The authorities had written it off as an unfortunate accident, something that happens when someone pushes themselves too far into the wilderness. But I knew that wasn't the truth. Deep down, I think the others knew it too, but no one wanted to talk about it anymore. It was easier to pretend that Jacob had simply gotten lost, easier to ignore the growing dread that something far more sinister was at play. Months went by, and the memory of that trip started to fade, at least for everyone else, but not for me. I kept thinking about that figure in the trees, the scratches in the cabin, the hair. It didn't make sense. I became obsessed, poring over old maps, reading up on local folklore, trying to make sense of what we had encountered. That part of the forest had a dark history, stories passed down through generations about people who went missing, about strange sightings, about the forest itself being alive. One night, I found myself back at the trailhead. I hadn't planned on going there. I'd just been driving around trying to clear my head, and before I knew it, I was parked at the same spot where Jacob had left his car. The moon was full that night, casting a cold, pale light over the landscape. The air was still, unnervingly quiet, like the world was holding its breath. I stood there, staring down the trail, the darkness between the trees seeming to pull me in. And that's when I heard it, a sound I hadn't heard since that last day in the forest. The faint, unmistakable creak of something moving just out of sight. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't an animal, it was deliberate, controlled. I froze, my heart racing as the sound grew louder, closer. My mind screamed at me to leave, to turn around and drive as far away from that place as I could. But I didn't. Instead, I stepped forward. One step at a time, I moved toward the trees, the darkness swallowing me whole as the trailhead disappeared behind me. The forest was colder than I remembered. Every breath I took hung in the air like a ghostly mist, and the silence was oppressive, almost physical. I walked for what felt like hours, my flashlight cutting through the shadows, illuminating the twisted branches overhead. My footsteps echoed unnaturally in the stillness, as if the forest itself was amplifying every sound. And then, just like before, I felt it, that sensation of being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I stopped in my tracks. I swung the flashlight around, scanning the trees, but there was nothing. Nothing except that overwhelming feeling that something was right behind me, just out of reach. My breath quickened, and I turned, ready to run. But before I could take a step, I heard it, Jacob's voice. Help. It was faint, barely more than a whisper, but I knew it was him. I knew it in my bones. My blood turned to ice as I scanned the darkness, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice came again, clearer this time, but weak, desperate. Help me, please. I called out his name, my voice trembling. No response. Just the sound of my own breathing and the wind rustling through the trees. But I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't leave, not when I was so close. I followed the sound, deeper into the woods, until I found myself standing at the edge of the same clearing where we had found his bike. The cabin was there, just as I had left it, rotting and decayed, but somehow different. The air around it felt thick, like walking through syrup, and the smell was even worse than before. Pungent, decayed. My stomach turned as I approached the door, the flashlight flickering in my hand. I didn't want to go inside. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to turn around, to get the hell out of there, but Jacob's voice called out again, softer now, almost a whimper. I pushed the door open, the wood creaking under my weight, and stepped inside. The room was just as we had left it, scratched walls, bones on the floor. But something was wrong. The pile of hair in the corner was gone. The air felt heavier, oppressive, and the shadows seemed to move on their own, twisting and stretching across the walls. And then I saw it. In the far corner of the room, huddled in the darkness, was a figure, Jacob. He was curled up, his back to me, his clothes torn and dirty. His hair was matted with mud and blood. My heart leapt into my throat as I rushed toward him, but something stopped me. Something. Off. His breathing was shallow, labored, but he wasn't moving. Jacob? I whispered, my voice shaking. Slowly, painfully, he turned to face me. His eyes were wide, empty, his face gaunt and pale. But it wasn't Jacob. Not really. His mouth moved, but the voice that came out wasn't his own. You shouldn't have come back. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. The figure stood, slowly, unnaturally, its limbs twisting in ways that shouldn't be possible. Its eyes, those same glowing eyes I had seen in the woods, bored into me, and I realized with a sickening dread that this thing had been wearing Jacob's skin, using his voice all along. I ran. I don't remember how I made it out of the forest, but I did. My body ached, my lungs burned, but I didn't stop until I was back in my car, the engine roaring to life as I sped away from that place, the cabin shrinking in my rearview mirror. Jacob was never found, but I know the truth. Whatever lives in that forest, whatever took him, it's still there, and it's waiting. So if you ever find yourself on a lonely trail, deep in the woods, and you hear someone calling out for help, no matter how familiar their voice might seem, don't follow it. Trust me, it's not who you think it is.